thank you for hosting. Thank you for your company's participation in the Conversations with Colleagues program. Before I turn it over to you, James, I want to tell our guests thank you for joining us. I think you're going to like this panel. And if any of our corporate members are interested in proposing a panel for later months and topics for Conversation with Colleagues, please contact me at any time. We have several months that are available for the rest of the year. So with that, James, I will hand it over to you, and it is your bus to drive.
All righty. Thank you very much, Frank. Just a quick brief here that CCAAAE is an innovative, progressive, full-service architectural engineering firm. We bring our experience providing professional engineering services at commercial service and general aviation airports. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of STV, a leader in providing engineering, architectural, planning, environmental, and program management and construction management services for transportation systems, infrastructure, buildings, energy, water, and other facilities. The point of today, Dana Barton is a director with Meeting the Challenge Incorporated, also a CCAAAE company. They are an accessibility compliance consulting firm that serves individuals and organizations with rights and responsibilities for compliance with federal disability rights laws. MTC has broad-based knowledge, resources, and an affiliate network to provide clients with solutions to solve their disability law compliance challenges and increase access for people with disabilities. Dana, I'm handing the keys to you.
Perfect. Thanks, James. And thanks for everyone logging in and participating today. This is a topic that is near and dear to our heart, as we are often in airports and traveling and working with individuals with disabilities. And we understand that access when you travel is so critically important. So I'm going to moderate today's session. I've got some questions for our panel, but the first thing I'd like to do is to introduce our panel, have them tell you a little bit about who they are and their role, and also have them answer the question why airport accessibility is important to them. So with that, I'm going to start with Tambry. If you would take a moment to introduce yourself.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Tambry Moten. I'm the ADA program manager for the Houston airports. So that covers George Bush International and also Hobby. I'm excited that I was welcomed here today. This topic is one that I'm very passionate about. I am an evangelist for disability, so I'm always wanting to talk about it. What I do like, well, not what I like, what I feel is important about airport accessibility is that it's dynamic, it's unique. Every day is not the same when it comes to our job. One day it could be in regards to customer experience. The next day we're looking at structural accessibility. And then the day after that, we're helping, maybe a child experience the magic of flight for the first time. So I really feel that airport accessibility is important because it impacts, more than just an individual customer. It impacts our communities. And I think that being able to fly, it should be available to everybody. So we should fight to have that equitable access in our airports.
Thanks, Tambry. All right, next I'm going to toss it over to Dr. Scott Crawford.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Scott Crawford. I'm an accessibility advocate. I live with multiple sclerosis. I use a power wheelchair for mobility, and I have somewhat limited use of my hands. But I travel via air quite often. At least I did before COVID, and I hope to again soon. And people with disabilities, we're a diverse group. We have different abilities and disabilities, and but we use air travel much in the same way everyone else does. We go on vacations, we go to meetings, we stay a part of society through air travel. And so it's absolutely vital that it be accessible. The other thing I want to just point out quickly is that everything that can go wrong with the general public can go wrong with us too, except usually the consequences are worse. So that's the point that I want to emphasize, that the ounce of prevention is worth the pound of cure. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. And Carol Reagan from Denver International Airport.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Carol Reagan from Denver International Airport. I've been at the airport coming up on a year now. Prior to being the ADA and Title VI administrator for DEN, I was the ADA coordinator for a large hospital in Colorado. And I did that for 7 years. So my background is in healthcare, but accessibility is really is across every industry. And I would agree with Tambre and Dr. Crawford, everything that they said, but just add that airport accessibility is important to me because it's an extension of our society. It's an extension of our public lives. It's a way for all of us to have freedom to be able to travel, not only from state to state, but across the world. So I too am an evangelist and I love accessibility. Stumbled into this area from working in healthcare, but love it and I would never leave.
That's awesome. Thank you. And then last but certainly not least, Jeff Ames, who's my colleague here at Meeting the Challenge, if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Jeff Ames. I've been here at Meeting the Challenge since officially since 2002. I've dealt with pretty much all aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Transportation has always been really important to me, all aspects of transportation, but air travel, of course, because nowadays that's just how we assume you get around the country. All of the things that the ADA promises to people with disabilities, access to public services, to public businesses, to all the things that everybody else does in our society, including tourism travel, are things that we can promise to people, but if you can't get there, the promise is kind of empty. In the last 2 years, we've seen kind of a strange situation where sometimes we can't get in person with people. I know I've missed seeing my grandkids as often as I would like to because I have to travel to get there. But we've adapted. We've come up with virtual ways of getting places. I think all of us would agree that's great. It's a great substitute, but it's not the same thing as seeing people in person, face to face.
Thanks, Jeff. And I guess I wanted to start off with an overview of the ADA and what the responsibilities are within airports. So Jeff, could you share with us a little bit about the ADA, how often it's updated, and if there are state or local requirements?
Okay, well, first of all, the big overview, airports are one of the most complicated places to be in compliance because there's not just one set of rules. Both Title II in a public airport and Title III of the ADA apply. Regulations under the ADA have not changed much in the last, I'm going to say 12 years, realistically. The enforceability of the most recent standards began officially 10 years ago in March in 2012. The building codes and the underlying accessibility requirements of the ANSI are changed pretty much every 2 to 3 years and updated every 2 to 3 years. The federal government moves much more slowly. But to go on with this, airports also have to comply, in addition to ADA compliance, they have to comply with the Air Carriers Accessibility Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and there's all these mutual responsibilities between the airport administration, tenants in the airport, which includes airlines, and they have SCCAAA requirements and ADA requirements, and then concessions, any of the businesses that operate, any restaurant or other retail establishment that is operated in leased space from an airport, they have they have Title III responsibilities, but the airport also has a responsibility to make sure that access to those spaces is available. And this also includes, there's an overlap in kind of the services that are provided to people within the airport. Airlines have a great deal of the responsibility in terms of getting people from gate to gate and so on and so forth. But if that access between gates is not accessible because the airport has not made it accessible, then the airline kind of has to turn to the airport and say, well, you need to help us out. There's equipment, there's shared use equipment, such as power lifts for loading power wheelchairs onto airplanes, which save injuries to airport and airline employees and things like that. So there's a broad spectrum of issues that come up. And, you know, I think there's some tendency to, you know, sort of point to the other guy and say, well, that's his responsibility. The fact of the matter is, it's everybody's responsibility. And, you know, certainly a passenger who's caught between the airline saying, well, hey, we got him where he needs to go, and the airport saying, well, yeah, but that's an airline responsibility to get him to the next stage or what on. That's not what the passenger wants to hear. What they want is a seamless trip from gate to gate, from, you know, onto the plane, off of the plane, et cetera, and everybody has to do their job for that to work right.
Well, playing off of that, a question for Tambry and Carol would be, as you are coordinating between all of these different entities and their responsibilities, what challenges have you faced, and how have you found solutions to those challenges? And either one of you can go.
Well, in the state of Texas, to just kind of piggyback off of what Jeff was saying, we also do have a law that determines, as far as construction projects, you know, what's the expectation. So the Texas Accessibility Standards was put in place to be a proactive law that mirrors the ADA, and sometimes it's actually a little bit stricter. So we're navigating our state law, and then we're also navigating the ADA. And then we have all these other complicated relationships because the airport is just such a unique environment. So being the Department of Aviation under the city of Houston, you know, we're also, we're a public accommodation, we're a public service, and we also have employees. So we're touching all of the titles of the ADA. And then we also have a website. So there's so many different complications, and it really is about communication. And I'm sorry, it's about the ADA coordinators being up in everybody's business, unfortunately. So in order to make sure that you understand what you need to be in compliance with, you have to make sure that you take an interest in every aspect that impacts the ADA.
Great.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Jeff had mentioned it's the responsibility of making sure that the traveler, the customer, has a seamless experience. And I would say that the barriers come in all of that. So as Tambry was speaking to, making sure the seamless experience starts from when the customer is planning their trip on the website, to arriving to the parking lot, or the curbside drop off, to the ticket counter, through security, and then eventually boarding on the plane. Trying to manage all of those pieces when you don't necessarily have the authority over all of those sections can definitely be a barrier. And it's something that I deal with every day.
And so you mentioned, Carol, maybe not having the authority. Where would that authority come from, and how could folks on this call help within their own organization to provide that to ADA coordinators?
So Tambry kind of touched upon this. It's partnering with everyone under the roof of the airport. It's influencing others to make sure that they understand what accessibility is and why it is important. It's getting in front of leaders as frequently as possible. I mean, I have a regular cadence where I'm meeting with executives on it every 6 weeks, just to show what we're doing and to show the progress of that. So it's just getting in front of people.
That's great. And Tambry, do you have a similar cadence or rhythm with your leadership?
Yes, yes. So I have, been very blessed to get placements at, where it counts. So I attend the infrastructure meetings so that I can understand as far as construction projects, what's going on, what type of impacts are we going to have towards the traffic and flow of our terminals. I meet with terminal management and just talk about their different issues. If there are issues with the providers and the carriers when it comes to providing accessibility services, just trying to work through those problems and trying to, figure out the solutions. And then also with our customer facing and public facing teams like marketing, trying to make sure that we're getting the word out on what we have to offer so that at the end of the day, customers, when they do complain, or if there is some type of miscommunication on what amenities we have to offer, we're making sure that we're putting that out into the public so they can understand this is what we have. We have created these amenities with your presence in mind. So just really working with everybody is the best way to get the job done.
Great, thank you. I'd like to kind of steer the conversation, and I think maybe we'll start this question with Scott, but what, in your experience, is the current state of accessibility within airports?
Well, of course, it varies from airport to airport.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some that were just outstanding. And I was able to seamlessly get through the airport, connect with public transit, and get to my destination with minimal to no problems at all. And others, it can be a serious problem. Like, for instance, here's a serious problem. If you can't get a wheelchair user to the airport in your jurisdiction, that is a major violation and it's a showstopper. You've just got to have wheelchair accessible transportation to and from your airport, wherever that may be. So that's just one example. Other examples, Jeff has brought up how we all have to work together to provide this seamless connection. And, people with varying disabilities are going to need different assistance. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, my friends who are blind, when they arrive at the curb, they will need assistance checking their bags and finding the kiosk. And the kiosk needs to be accessible for people who are blind. And they'll probably need a sighted guide to take them through TSA and onto their gate. So there you go. And all this has to be seamless.
Mm-hmm. What does it do for the traveler when there is inconsistency? So, you've mentioned that in some airports, it's going to be a seamless transition, and in others, you might not know what you're getting. How does that affect you when you're traveling?
Yeah. Okay. Another example of how things can go wrong. More than a decade ago, I would travel without my power wheelchair. I would just check it all the way through to my destination, and I would let people push me from gate to gate. Now, what happened is that they pushed me to the proper gate 3 hours in advance, and that gate changed. And there was nobody there to come, quote, rescue me. And I was stuck at a gate that was empty, and I knew, hey, something's wrong. We're supposed to have people here, and I was stuck. So that's one of those examples of how things can go badly wrong.
Sure. So to play on that, Jeff, in a situation like that, where does the responsibility lie for a gate change or for transport within the facility of the airport?
Well, ultimately, I would think that it is the airport's responsibility, but under the Air Carriers Access Act, the airline is responsible for passengers getting from one gate to the next. But I guess the rub here would come in to say, certainly a passenger shouldn't fall off the radar, that somebody should be keeping track. And, you know, I guess airport personnel, if they saw somebody sitting at a gate looking like kind of frantic that they needed to be someplace else, it certainly wouldn't hurt to stop and ask, say, Dr. Crawford, where are you supposed to be? And he says, I don't know, my gate's been changed and nobody told me. And certainly then, you know, find him somebody to give a hand. Certainly, I think the airlines have maybe the biggest responsibility in that case. But, you know, if somebody's just stranded at an airport, I mean, if there were a child wandering loose, lost, and can't find its parents at the airport, I think everybody would be responsible for finding, you know, and not to say that an adult with a disability is a child, but in other words, their transit through your airport being seamless is everybody's responsibility. And you can't just say, well, hey, the airline should have taken care of that. You know, and if a person, for instance, gets stranded in your airport because the airline screwed up, at some point, I think, you know, you've got this person, you have to figure out where and how are you going to help them.
Thank you. And so back to our airport representatives, Tambry and Carol, are there coordination efforts that you all are participating in to make sure that we're not leaving a passenger behind? What are you doing to remedy that should it happen?
Of course. So, you know, I'm not sure how other airports operate, but I do have my phone with me. It's on. And that is the time that a traveler would call me. And travelers, they do not make any type of, they don't distinguish between the airline and the airport. Okay. So if something goes down at the airport, they're not saying United, they're not saying Southwest did it. They're saying it happened at Houston airports or whatever airport they're at. So it really does lay on the airport because we're trying to protect our reputation and make sure that our customers, they're provided the best experience. So I'm not upset when a customer, you know, calls me. I've had the experience where a customer has called me and said, hey, I am stranded. I don't know what happened. The person that was pushing me, they said they were coming back and they didn't come back. And I've literally gotten on my phone, walked down to the ticketing lobby and said, hey, I have a customer on the phone. Can you please help me figure out how to get them? And I mean, they were surprised because they didn't know that, hey, somebody's got that customer's back. And I mean, that's, you know, kind of the coordination that happens there. It's us working together with the air carriers and, you know, just trying to make that seamless transition. So I'm not even offended when they call because that's the perfect time to call. Call me.
Absolutely.
Can I interrupt for just a second and ask Tambry a question? So as I understand it, sometimes at airports, it's not even the airline per se. They maybe contract out or the airport contracts out, and there's another third party who's actually responsible who gets handed off to say, you know, get this passenger to the next gate. And if they slip, you know, somebody's got to be overseeing them. Somebody's got to be saying, hey, wait a second. The ultimate passenger experience is the responsibility. The buck stops. And I think in Houston, it stops with you, right, Tambry?
Yes, customer experience and just, I'm going to call it's an accessibility experience. So it's more than just customer service. It's the full facility, what we're providing. And so the buck does stop with the ADA coordinators or ADA program managers at the airports, because you do have to navigate at the finger pointing. That's going to happen. And you're going to have to say, look, at the end of the day, we're protecting a reputation and we are trying to get this customer through the airport. So we have to work together to get it done.
Amen.
Carol, do you have anything to add about the coordination between different parties when something might arise for a person with a disability?
I agree with everything that has been said. It's a 24/7 operations. And so as Tambray was stating, that we do have our information, our phones, our cell phones are listed on the website. And it's a constant coordination of not only with customer service, our customer service and customer experience teams, and our volunteers who are our airport ambassadors, but also I have the numbers to the supervisors of those third-party wheelchair vendors and the dispatch phone numbers to be able to connect customers where they need to be and to find passengers if there's been an issue. So I'm connected, fully connected with all of the partners.
Great. So something that's been brought up several different times in this conversation so far is kind of apart from those physical barriers. So Scott mentioned if a blind passenger shows up and they need assistance to the kiosk. I know Jeff has done some work on kiosks at the Denver International Airport. Tambray mentioned the website. Carol just mentioned, her cell phone is listed on the website. So what other barriers might exist for travelers with disabilities aside from those physical barriers? I don't know who wants to take that question, but I would love to hear about that some more.
I would say, because I know that we already talked about the airport websites, and just an example, if an airport website is not accessible, it's the equivalent to a business locking their door. So travelers, they want to know what your airport is like before they get there. I've had, parents call me and just ask, what do the tie downs look like on the rental car shuttles? Because I'm, traveling for the first time, I'm bringing my son, he has CP, and I just want to know, what is it going to be like when we get on the shuttle? So having just some glimpses of what your airport looks like, that can really help a passenger. Another thing that we might not have covered is the language barrier. So we're international airports, we're serving international customers. So the amenities, they need to be in other languages. And not only other languages, we also need to offer other languages to travelers when they're trying to get help. So something that I know we've done at Houston airports is we've added ASL as one of those languages, because it's not just about, speech. It's also about helping those that, they're not able to speak and they are signing. And so that's, another thing. We need to look at languages and just making sure that our sites are accessible.
Very good. Does anyone else? Perfect, Carol.
I would agree, Dana. I would say that a barrier is probably wayfinding and navigation.
Mm-hmm.
We're a large airport, a large international airport, and wayfinding and navigation between the construction. There's construction all the time. So I know that's an issue. As Dr. Crawford mentioned, the wheelchair options that can sometimes have issues with that. I'm just being transparent. There's not always a seamless experience for customers, and I think that it's more systemic because of the low pay for these type of jobs and the high turnover. I think it's an issue across all airports.
Yeah, I think staffing is an issue for everyone, and when you're so focused on getting the right staff member in and you're short staffed, you just plug someone into a position and say, okay, you're figuring it out on the job, rather than I think years past I've been able to be a lot more intentional about the onboarding process and training and things like that. So that's something to consider as well. Thank you, Carol. Jeff, could you speak for just a quick moment about the kiosks? I think that's a really interesting topic.
So the ADA standards don't mention kiosks. They talk about ATMs and fare machines, which fare machines typically we're talking about like for, light rail or buses or whatever. There are extensive criteria in the Air Carriers Access Act. But best practices between ADA and the Air Carriers Access Act, obviously you need to have the capacity to put in a headphone and get audible communication. So if somebody's blind, or in some cases, maybe somebody is hard of hearing and they need to be able to amplify that sound. So that's a key part of it. If the operational controls on a kiosk are simply a touch screen, or, you know, like a mouse type control where there's a device that you point and click and so on and so forth, that's obviously not going to work for certain people with certain kinds of disabilities. Somebody who doesn't have good manual control to be able to, you know, touch a screen or move a mouse or whatever is going to have issues. Somebody who's blind and can't see what they're supposed to be pointing and clicking at. Even somebody who's low vision could be looking at a screen, and I'm not going to name which airline, but I know one airline, their kiosks have a fairly light blue background and blue text on the screen. I think that the background is maybe sky and clouds and stuff like that. For somebody with low vision, there's not enough contrast there for them to be able to read it. Even understanding things like color blindness. You know, if you put something red on white, for somebody who's colorblind, that is going to look like gray, and they may not see what it is they need to follow. So those are some of the simple things. Obviously, physical access, so that all the controls and the level of the screen, so that somebody can see it from a wheelchair. All of those things are important as well. Perfect.
And we had a question come up in the chat from Paul McDonough. The question is, are there mechanisms whereby, say, a blind person can make arrangements ahead of time to be met at the curb, with staffing issues being a problem across all curb to gate operations? Some type of pre-travel electronic coordination seems like the way to go. And I think, Dr. Crawford, you were hoping to answer this one.
Yes, that is a great point. And yes, there is. Yes, there is. All airlines that I've ever used have a ADA request for accommodation process. You can either do it online via an accessible form and type your answers, or you can do it via phone. I've done it both ways, and I found it very thorough, very complete, very accurate. There's only one problem, and you're just not going to believe this. Not once has anyone at the airport or the airline ever looked at them. So unfortunately, in theory, yes. In practice, to my experience, it's never worked. I agree with you. This is best practice. You know, you want to request in advance what you will need so that we can set it up. In practice, it has never yet worked for me.
Very interesting. I would love to hear a response from Tambry and Carol about how that works within your airport systems.
Yes, so Dr. Crawford, you're right. A little, somewhat, and I know your experience is definitely your experience. So how airlines, how they intake their customers that are requiring accessibility needs, it's usually within the reservations process. So my best advice, and I have customers that call and they just want to know, how do I do it? And I'm quick to tell them, look, you're going to need to contact your airline, ask for their accessibility desk. Now, accessibility desk or a means for a traveler with disabilities to contact the airline, that is a requirement under the Air Carrier Access Act. And so when you go onto a website for an air carrier, they must have an accessibility service. Okay, so if that doesn't work, the next person that you would contact is us, your ADA program manager, your a coordinator. And we typically have the form that is the reasonable accommodations process, okay? It is required, the FAA requires airports to have a means to request a reasonable accommodation. So that could be the backup plan. A customer can submit a reasonable accommodation request, and then we would have knowledge that when they're coming, the service that they're inspecting, and if it is, okay, I need to go from curbside to the ticket counter, that's not a hard request. And we can reach out to the airlines, which I have done. Either I'm talking to their station manager, or I'm taking it to the next step and contacting their complaint resolution official, which is their version of their ADA coordinator for the airline. So they're getting involved because I definitely don't want a complaint. So I'm going to make sure that we're covering all bases. And if that electronic system is not working, we got a backup plan on how we're going to get that traveler where they need to go.
Agree. We have, if the customer is not accommodated by the airline itself, then we do have a meet and assist service. Now that service is limited. It's only 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. And it is, we require 48 hours in advance notice so that we can know what the actual accommodation is. And if it is to assist a blind customer from the curb all the way to the person's gate, then we do make that accommodation available through that meet and assist service. Again, it's based on staffing, our staffing model for the day. And so that's why we request 48 hours in advance, but we do have a service. And typically since we have more control over our meet and assist service through the airport, it typically gets done because it's a scheduled accommodation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I'd like to add, I think most people touched on it in this discussion, is that sometimes there are electronic forms or applications that you can fill out, or a phone number. I just think it's really important to remember that you need multiple methods for individuals to be able to contact and request this, because one form of communication does not fit all. And it's even more important if you're asking people to provide information online or through a web portal, that is accessible as well. And I know we work with a lot of municipalities that say, oh, yep, our vendor told us our website's accessible. And that's great. But until you've had some users go through it and really try to access stuff, and you've trained your content creators, a lot of times we find that things aren't as accessible as we think they are. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. So what I'd like to kind of flip to is to talk about best practices. And Jeff, I think that you had mentioned that Scott had shared some pictures with you of things you've seen as best practices. But I would love to give everyone a couple of minutes to talk about what best practices they've seen, or maybe what best practices you're looking to implement within your own organization right now. So, but Jeff, maybe do you want to get started on that one? Oh, there you go. And I think you're on mute as well, Jeff.
So far this summer. You want me to jump in here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Go ahead.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay. So Scott sent this over, and this is a picture of essentially the ability to pick a floor on the elevator using the footrest on a wheelchair, which, if you think about, what it's like getting through an airport and you've got your luggage and everything, and just even pushing the button on the elevator, it could be a challenge. And Scott sent this. And Scott, where was this? Do you remember what airport this was in?
It was actually not in an airport.
Oh, okay.
It was in.
Should have been in an airport.
Yes, should have been, but it was in San Francisco, and it was at one of the Metro Rail stations in San Francisco, and I thought it was just a thing. It was a thing.
I think some of our participants might not have their phones on mute, so
still too unsafe to host competitions and move the match to Saudi Arabia.
I would ask that any of our participants mute their phones.
Are we being Zoom bound?
Iraqi fans had organized a giant watch party in their.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay, are we ready to start again?
Yes.
Okay, so
Thank you.
yeah, so one point I always try to make is that accommodations for people with disabilities often help everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the era of COVID, nobody wants to be touching buttons, and this you can just hit with your foot or your wheelchair foot pad. So it helps everybody else. That's one point I'd like to make. Go on to the next photo. Okay, this was Seattle. I found it outstanding because I could get from the gate all the way to public transit in my wheelchair, pushing my luggage, which unfortunately is really heavy. That's something we could get into, but unfortunately, it's impossible for people like me with significant disabilities to travel light. We just can't do it. So, but anyway, I found this wonderful because I was able to push that that suitcase with tiny caster wheels the whole way and get on the Metro Rail system seamlessly.
And why was that?
Well,
what made it a
because,
seamless experience for you?
Okay, one, there was good wayfinding, excellent signage. And you can see in this photograph, there's great contrast.
Mm-hmm.
There's white lettering on a very dark background, and there are icons showing transit. There were plenty of those signs. I found the elevators easy to find. Things like that. Okay. Yeah. And even the little details like no lips, no surface discontinuities, as we call it in ADA. You know, you didn't have to climb a step. You didn't have to climb a lip. Those things are inordinately difficult for folks with significant disabilities. Think about quadriplegia.
Right. Let's take a look at one more picture, and then I'd like to hear from Tambry and Carol on what some of their best practices are.
Yeah, this is something not to do. And we, wheelchair users, we travel with our legs and we get separated from our legs and they get put in the cargo hold. Now, that needs to change as soon as possible, but until it does, we need to not be lifting these wheelchairs because mine happens to be 430 pounds empty, and it's not meant to be picked up. So this is an ideal solution. This is best practice. It's a hydraulic lift. It could be operated by one person. If every airport had one of these within 5 minutes of every gate, your complaints would go dramatically down because nobody's wheelchair would be damaged. And frankly, your employees wouldn't be getting injuries.
Sure. And does that responsibility fall on the airline or the airport for loading these a wheelchair, or are we?
It's technically the airline.
Airline, yeah.
It's technically the airline, but again, from the perspective of the consumer, we don't care. It
happened at that airport, absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing these photos with us. I think visual, I know for me, is always is good. So now I'd like to see if Carol or Tambry, if you can talk to us about some of your best practices at your airports.
Sure. So some of the things that we're doing is we have the IRA, which is much like it's a visual interpretation app for blind users or blind or low vision users. We also recently started participating in the Sunflower Hidden Disabilities Program, which it's just really taken off at DEN, and the employees love it. We're partnering with community disability organizations, and they are helping to get out the word. In addition to passing out lanyards, it's created a partnership where we're creating training on different disabilities for employees, doing lunch and learns. We are also looking at designing sensory rooms and quiet spaces, because that is becoming an increasingly an accommodation by our passengers. And so looking and creating spaces in not only the terminal, but on each and every concourse. Let's see, we're also looking into improving our signage, so that, I think it was Jeff that was speaking to the contrast on how the visual monitors look, and also the stationary signage. Acoustic accessibility can be a problem, I think, in every airport, but looking at ways on how we can increase accessibility, especially when you're going through the security checkpoints. Oftentimes the TSA agents will often shout out multi-step directions to people, and not everyone standing in that line is able to hear those directions. So working on how do we make that area more accessible when it comes to acoustics.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And Tambry?
Carol, I'm taking notes. Now, we do have a lot of the same programs that you've mentioned. And I guess what I want to talk about is things that I'm looking to implement, because we have IRA. Perfect. We have, effective communication, and, really trying to make sure that those services we understand while they're there. But some things that sometimes we don't look at is the operational exercises. So sometimes the airports, when they're practicing for emergencies, we forget about our customers with disabilities and how they're going to react in this situation, and what communication needs and what evacuation needs that they're going to require. So we recently had an exercise, and I had a seat at the table, and I was so excited. And, I was able to impact and help them understand, well, the air carrier, they're going to have the information on what customers they had that required special assistance, because they're using those codes to identify those passengers at the reservation checkpoint. So I know that's one thing that I know that's a best practice that needs to be looked at. And another thing is working with concessionaires. So something that I've explored, and I learned this through the FAA civil rights training, is secret shopping. So finding out what your concessionaires, what are they doing? Are they offering accessibility services? If a customer requests a Braille menu, a large print menu, are they offering that? Something that I've seen in Five Guys, I saw a lowered options for the sodas. So making sure that self-services are in the right location. So those, type of things that we overlook, that we take for granted, just finding those small details and making sure that we pull those out and help understand the importance of them and the importance that it impacts on the experience for that customer.
Thank you.
Can I add one more thing?
Of course.
I add one more, a best practice across the airport is just, constantly promoting that it's a shared responsibility, accessibility, and it's not one person. It's not my role as the ADA is to do all of the accessibility across the airport. And it's constantly partnering with different stakeholders so that accessibility is not siloed. It's operationalizing accessibility into all of the SOPs. And that can be difficult, but yeah, it's just making sure you just have to be consistent as far as not to silo your programming, ADA programming, and make sure it's across all operations.
Yeah, I think I know, Carol, I've been on some calls with you with the state representative about what's happening at the Denver International Airport, and just brainstorming who should be brought to the table on a regular and a consistent basis in order to have conversations. I also know, while it's not airport specific, Delta Airlines has a really good group of passengers who are frequent travelers who have disabilities, and they come together to talk about their experiences with Delta across different airports. So definitely making sure that we are bringing the right folks to the table and having discussions. And again, I can't emphasize enough that it's not a one-time discussion. That this is an ongoing program and ongoing exercises that we should be having. So with that, we've got about 6 minutes left. I want to finish with one question, and then if there are other questions from the group, if you want to put those in the chat. But I'm curious from the perspective of each of you, where do you think we can start by making the biggest impact? What's the biggest impact we can have on passengers with disabilities?
So I wrote down this book that I think is really, really important, because it's not just something that I think needs to be read. It's a mantra that needs to be observed. So this book is written by Charles Charlton. It's named Nothing About Us Without Us. And when you are considering services to your customers with disabilities, the first step is to bring them in. Bring them in and find out what their needs are. You cannot create ideas. You cannot assume that you know what customers with disabilities need. You have to ask and observe, and also allow them to give that feedback. So that's my my take from that.
Thank you. Dr. Crawford.
Well, you know, speaking as a wheelchair user, wheelchair users won't be able to fly reliably and safely unless and until we can board the aircraft in our mobility devices and be secured like we would on a bus or a train. So that has to happen, and it has to happen just as soon as possible. And the consequences of delaying that just propagate out on the airports, on the airlines. You know, my goodness, you would save so many complaints and so many problems if I could just board the airline in my chair. So anyway, that would be my top goal.
Thank you. Jeff, I see you next in the line here.
So, I mean, I look at things from the perspective of, I guess, structural and policy compliance. And I will always reiterate that meeting the minimum standards put in the ADA is a passing grade, which I think, you know, would be a D. There's so much more that can be done. And as Tambry said, you have to listen to the people who you are trying to assist if you want to understand what they need in the way of assistance. And that's kind of square one. I mean, understand that this is not, strictly speaking, about architectural design standards. It's not about following a set of rules. It's about providing the best possible service to all customers who come through an airport.
Well said. Thank you. And Carol.
I would say investing in accessibility, and that includes human resources, the infrastructure, training, and technology. Oftentimes, and not just airports, but most organizations, it's one person as the ADA team, one person. So investing in accessibility shows that it's important to your organization. As Jeff alluded to, just going beyond compliance. Don't check the box, because you're not going to make great strides by doing that. I've been in check the box positions, and that doesn't work. So just be intentional. And when you make those job descriptions, be intentional about what the expectations are for that role for the ADA manager. Just be very intentional.
Thank you. I put a link to that book Tambry was talking about into the chat if anyone's interested. But looks like we also have a question from Brian. And the question is, do any of you have experience with the TSA Cares program, and how has it worked in your experience? And Dr. Crawford, I believe you have some experience. Would you like to share?
Yes, I have. The big take-home message is, if a person with a disability can afford to get TSA pre-check, that's best practice. It has helped me get through screenings faster and easier and in a less intrusive manner, because I can't go through the scanners. So it's always a pat down experience, and that can be awkward. And so anyway, get TSA pre-check if you can. I've done TSA Cares. I've also helped participate in trainings at TSA. So that can't happen enough. It just can't happen enough. Thanks.
Does anyone else have anything to add to the TSA Cares conversation?
I do. So we integrate TSA Cares into our airport rehearsal program. So it gives them the opportunity to come in contact with customers with disabilities, and it kind of allows them to be able to flex their skills, because TSA Cares agents, they're trained higher than the regular agents. So as long as the customer is proactive and they are able to make time to fill out that form, or if they do contact the ADA program manager or a coordinator and get it filled out ahead of time, I've had to assist customers with filling it out, the customer is going to have a different experience. So TSA Cares will meet them at the checkpoint. They'll know what time this customer is going to be coming. They'll have an agent assigned to their arrival, and they will help them get through the security point. It's just in a service that they have to request. So it's a reasonable accommodations, but TSAs.
Yeah, I have to tell you, my experience in actually getting that person, hit or miss.
Yes.
Hit or miss. That's why I defaulted to the TSA pre-check.
Sure.
Because I just couldn't guarantee that filling out all those forms would have an effect.
All right, we're butting up against time. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I think I'm going to speak for the panel, but I think any of us would be very interested in continuing a conversation or answering specific questions that you have. This is the work that we're all doing, and we're really proud of that work and would love to see that implemented in more airports across the U.S. So with that, James, are you going to close us out?
I will. Hey, I want to thank
you.
the panel. I want to thank the panel again. I got two key takeaways from this conversation. That first, it is a shared responsibility across all of the airport environment and stakeholders. But I hear this at many airports, the discussion of customer experience. And there's two key words that I heard here, and it was for all, customer experience for all. So those are the two things that I'm taking away from this, and that's excellent. Again, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank everybody who joined us. And then I want to pass the ball over to Grace to see if there's any closing comments from the chapter. Grace?
I do not have anything. So if y'all feel good about this, then we're good.
Awesome. Well, very good. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a good rest of your Monday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye now.